I am now joined by Professor David Benatar. Thank you for joining me, Professor.
Good, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, Professor Benatar is here to talk with me about antinatalism and our duties to do good. I'm going to briefly give an introduction and then we can go into the conversation, even though I'm sure with the audience that we've got, Professor Benatar doesn't really need much of an introduction. But for anyone that's maybe newer to the space of antinatalism, Professor David Benatar in 2006 published his book, Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence, which many see as, it's a very key antinatalist text. And then more recently, Professor David Benatar published Very Practical Ethics, which dives into a series of different everyday or quotidian ethical topics and explores those. And one of those is giving aid, which is going to be, what a lot of what we get into today. So to start with, Professor, I wanted to start with a few broader questions, and then we can go into more specifics. So I know in your book, you talk about both negative and positive duties. Are you able to just briefly flesh out what is the difference between negative and positive duties, and why, in your view, negative duties might be stronger than positive ones?
Well, negative duties are duties not to do certain things. So it's because it's a duty not to do something that it's a negative duty. And a positive duty is a duty to do something. So if you think, for example, about a duty not to kill somebody, that would be a negative duty. If you had a duty to save somebody's life, then that would be a positive duty. So that's the distinction. I think, insofar as you think that avoiding the infliction of harm on somebody is a moral priority, then you're going to think that the negative duties, or at least some of them, are going to have priority over equivalent positive duties, corresponding positive duties. And another feature of the difference between negative and positive duties is that negative duties are typically less in competition with one another. They're easier to fulfill. So if you're not killing somebody and not stealing from somebody and not defaming somebody, you can do all of these things at the same time by just doing nothing. You can just lie in bed or sit in your chair and not be doing all of those things. Whereas if you are going to be fulfilling purported positive duties, they are going to be in conflict with one another, in the sense that you've got a certain amount of time and other resources to use, and you have to make choices about which of these positive things you're going to do.
Yeah, and there are a range of situations that we might be faced with in everyday life or not so everyday life, where there will be actions that it's generally quite widely seen we're sort of required to do morally or obliged to do morally, whether those are positive or negative obligations or duties. But then there are other actions where they might be good to do, but you may not be sort of required or obliged to do them. Are there any sort of ways where we can, or tools we can use to judge whether any given possible action might be more obligatory or more just good rather than required?
Look, this is a subject of deep disagreement, and it often arises from different theoretical approaches. And so I don't think that one can, as they say, standing on one leg, give a response to that. I think what we can do is recognize that there is this category of supererogation, which is really going beyond the call of duty, doing more than duty requires. And different people with different views can have disagreements about where the extent of your duty ends and where supererogation begins. So for some people, our duties are very, very extensive, including our positive duties. There may be some supererogation beyond that, but the realm of supererogation is really rather limited. Whereas for other people, the extent of our duties, and especially our positive duties, is not that expansive at all. And then beyond that, there may be things that are praiseworthy, that for which you'll get moral credit, but which you're not strictly morally required to do.
Yeah, and I know this is obviously, I guess, a big point of contention within the especially effective giving or effective altruism space as to whether the giving of aid or donations to effective charities is an obligation that we all have if we do have like a level of disposable income, or if it's simply just good for us to do it, or maybe there's a level up to which it's obligatory and then above that it's good. Um, what are your views, if this isn't too general a question, what are your views on the extent of our positive duties to give aid to those that are less fortunate than us? I know Peter Singer obviously has quite a famous, very extensive view on this. But yeah, what are your views on this?
My views are somewhat intermediate between his and another extreme position, which says that we really have no positive duties to help others other than those that result from our voluntary undertakings. So there are some people who think that you just really have no duty to help other people unless you have, let's say, made a promise to help
Mm,
somebody, or you've acted negligently in a way that harmed them, and now you have a rectificatory positive duty to them as a result of this voluntary action that you undertook. So you've got these two broad views: one which really strips down the extent of our positive duties to next to nothing, and then this view that Peter Singer has and others have, that we have very, very extensive duties. And I find neither of those positions compelling. I think it's going to be somewhere in the middle.
mm,
So one thing I'd say is, let's imagine that you could help somebody with little or no cost to yourself. It seems odd to think that you've got no duty. So you're walking down the street and you see a drunk passed out in a puddle of water and he's going to drown unless you just turn him over. And it's really going to cost you nothing. You're not at risk in any way. Uh, just walking on by and not helping that person seems like you've violated your duty. It seems like you've not done what you ought to do. But then if you think about the iteration of Peter Singer's life-saving analogy, where you now ought to be giving much of what you have away, that is now a substantial sacrifice. Even if in the one case it's not a substantial sacrifice, the more you iterate this kind of thought experiment, you're going to have the consequence that you're giving away quite significant amounts or making rather big sacrifices in terms of your life projects and what you want to do. And it's just not clear to me that we do have duties of that extent. I think one becomes a kind of slave to others, and then I think for example, the Ayn Randian critique begins to have some plausibility. There's no plausibility, I think, in trying to excuse us from all positive duties, but the more you're sacrificing yourself for others, the more plausibility that kind of critique has.
mm. Yeah, it's funny you use the example of the drunk in the puddle, because being from England, I think that's a positive duty that we're actually quite often called to help people out with.
Sorry to hear that.
Um, yeah, so you mentioned that there might be particular individuals that we have. I can't remember if you use the term special duties or particular duties too. Um, so an obvious example, might be one's offspring. If you've had
Mm.
children, whether you've created them or adopt them, there's sort of like a voluntary sort of special duty you've taken on towards that individual that goes beyond maybe your duties to others. Um, you mentioned that a special duty towards someone might be generated by the fact that you've wronged them in some way. Can you think of, are there any other sort of factors in our relation to someone else that might generate a special duty towards them other than the fact that we might have wronged them?
Yes, making an explicit undertaking. So that's not a wronging. If you, let's say, adopt a child who needs adopting, you're not wronging that
Mm,
child, but you are making an undertaking to care for them. And then you may have duties of care to that person that you don't have to others. Now, of course, that very claim is controversial among extreme impartialists who have difficulty perhaps explaining in any kind of direct way why you might have a stronger duty to your own children than you would have to needy children elsewhere. So some of those consequentialists might say, for example, that there are indirect reasons why it's best to prioritize the caregiving of your own children, because doing that has better outcomes than otherwise. But they might dispute the idea that there's any kind of intrinsic value in discharging or in having and discharging those duties.
Mm. And do you think there's ever cases where someone can have a special duty to contribute towards the betterment of not just specific individuals, but like specific groups? So if I were to give, like a possible example, if you perhaps one example that I'm sure many of us can relate to is the fact that we may not have we may have used to eating animals, and maybe we've stopped eating animals and used them in other ways. Maybe we feel like a sense of obligation towards donating to charities or helping animals in some other way, even though the specific individual animals that we would have harmed will be different animals to the ones we're helping. Or you may have a politician who is engaged in corruption and sort of wronged the population they're supposed to be looking after or governing, and they've had a change of heart, and maybe they feel a special obligation towards those that sort of nation, for example. Is this like a coherent way of thinking about special duties as well?
It could be. Again, I don't want to plaster over disagreement that there would be between people with a more impartial view of morality and people with a more partial view. And we also need to recognize that not all arguments for giving aid are need-based arguments. So Peter Singer's argument is such an argument. It's based on the need of the person that you could help and your ability to help them. But if you think about some other kinds of arguments for duties to address world hunger, think arguments like Thomas Pogge's, for example, that is based more on either a complicity in the status quo that causes other people to be suffering, or in some benefit that you are deriving, whether or not you are complicit. And so some people think that those kinds of things can generate duties. Obviously, duties of rectification to particular individuals that you have harmed are going to be easier, I think, to justify than ones to a class of being that you've harmed. But I'm not saying that a case like that couldn't be made. It'd just probably be slightly more difficult.
Yeah. And when considering, whether to give aid or how to give aid, and we're talking about maybe like the average person here, or maybe the average person that would view, an interview like this, what kind of considerations do you think someone needs to take into account when deciding which causes or individuals or organizations they might prioritize giving aid to?
Okay, so this looks like a question about effective altruism without mentioning that term.
Well, so I was assuming that the effectiveness of how the money would be spent would factor into your answer, but I wasn't trying to preclude anything else, because you may think that there are other things, that might determine where you would want to give aid.
Yes. So let me say a few things. First of all, I don't think that effective altruism in itself has to be committed to very extensive duties. So there are two questions here. The one is, how extensive are your positive duties to assist others? And then there's another question that when you're giving, should you be giving as effectively as you can give? Now, in practice, people who are effective altruists very often are also people who think that we have very extensive duties. But these are conceptually separate views, even if they often come together. And I certainly think that there's a very strong case to be made for effective giving. But if you are moved, for example, by concerns about rectifying injustices that you've played some role in sustaining or in generating, or if you think that you have other special duties, then it's unlikely that effectiveness is going to be the only consideration that you will need to factor in. There may be others as well. So it may be that if you're living in a pretty poor society and there are people in your society who need help, somebody might make the case that at least some of your giving should be to those people, even if you could be giving more effectively to people in some distant country that's even poorer.
Yeah. And you said that you think a strong case could be made for basing our prioritization of where we give aid on the effectiveness of how it's going to be used, or the impact that it would have. But do you have any, I know even within the effective altruist space, there's maybe some debate on how we can measure or think about effectiveness. Do you have any like particular ways that you think about effectiveness, or any sort of qualms you have with how it's often thought about in the effective altruism space? I know obviously there will be other people outside of the EA space that think about effectiveness, but it's obviously very commonly associated with EA.
Yes, look, I don't have strong views on this. I think these are very often heavily empirical questions, but not entirely, because sometimes there's an element of evaluation that that is creeping in as well. But given the extent to which there are empirical questions, you require a kind of empirical expertise, and it's a moving expertise, because as effective altruists are very ready to acknowledge, the charity that it may be most effective to give to now might not be the charity that it's most effective to give to in 6 months' time or a year, for a range of reasons. And so I can't claim expertise on in any moment what the most effective way to give is. But I suppose one concern I do have is overconfidence in what is effective. And I think that here my concerns about long-termism would be relevant. So I am concerned that people are trying to make calculations about what will be happening in 10,000 years' time or 100,000 years' time, and we don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. And so I do worry about a kind of epistemic hubris. I think we need to be very cautious about that.
Yes. Do you think there's any like limited sense in which we can build a sort of long-termist view of being effective into how we think about doing good? Or do you think that long-termism, whilst maybe in theory it might be quite a good idea, in that obviously we should consider the long-term implications of our actions, but in practice it's actually pretty infeasible to use as any sort of guidance for how we should act?
Yes, I think it's going to depend on what you mean by the long term. So there's a sense in which it's very reasonable for any one of us to think long term. If you view at the beginning of your career, you should begin to think about a retirement planning. That's thinking about the long term in terms of your life scale and your lifeline. And similarly, I think when we're thinking about the environment, we shouldn't just be thinking about what's going to happen in the next year. We should be thinking about the longer term, because otherwise we're going to get into we as a species and other species are going to get into very real dangers. But if you're speaking about sort of cosmic time, if you're speaking about periods of 10,000 years and 100,000 years, I think our levels of confidence there just need to be reduced to very low levels. We're going to have heavy discounting when we're thinking about that kind of time.
Yeah, and one thing I've sort of semi-experienced myself, but I've definitely observed in others, is this idea that especially when you're thinking about where the most effective place to give aid to or charities to donate to, especially if you're considering a sort of long-termist view, is this idea of like decision or giving paralysis. I don't know if that is the actual term that people use, but I'm sure maybe you're understanding what I'm trying to get at. How do you think people should respond to this form of paralysis? Is there sort of like is there a sort of a bug in their mindset that is producing the paralysis, or is it completely natural, but there's some sort of remedy that we can administer? Is there any thoughts you have on this sort of paralysis?
I think it depends on what's causing it. So if it's about deep uncertainties, let's say about the very distant future, then I think there's a sense in which it's reasonable to be paralyzed by that kind of degree of uncertainty. Whereas that wouldn't be the case if you were really thinking about which charity to contribute now that could make either a difference now in one way or a difference now in another way. And there it may be that, again, we can't get certainty, but our confidence levels should be much higher. And then if you're paralyzed in the face of that degree of uncertainty, that just seems much less reasonable.
Mm. And I think you've maybe suggested in one of your previous answers that you might not be able to give an answer to this next question, but I'm going to attempt to maybe bait you into answering a question on these lines. But obviously, if you don't have like a specific answer for it, then we can move on. But are there any even like broad issues today or causes today that you think people should consider supporting by giving aid or like volunteering or some other way that you think are going to be pretty reliably good and effective to donate to or spend some time working on?
Well, again, I wouldn't want to give any kind of unqualified answer, but given that this is an antinatalist conference, let me say that I do think that antinatalist ventures have not been given the kind of due attention they should be given. If you think about, let's say, poverty relief measures versus preventing people from being born into poverty through, for example, the provision of contraception to people who have an unmet desire and need for it, you're going to be doing much more poverty prevention through, let's say, the provision of birth control than you are through one of these other measures, which really just relieve poverty to some extent. They don't prevent people falling back into poverty. They don't prevent any the things that you're not particularly addressing. So let's imagine you're addressing malaria through malaria nets. Well, now you're not addressing any of the other number of problems that people in poverty can be experiencing. So I think that preventing lives from starting is real, can be real poverty prevention, as opposed to these other things which are at best relieving instances of suffering within a life of poverty.
Yeah, no, and we are going to get onto some more specific antinatalist questions as well. But yeah, thank you for that answer. So there are certain forms of giving aid, or there may be certain charities or causes that one may be thinking of giving to that can come with what you might perceive as like potential moral conflicts. So, for example, I think this is one that has been spoken about and papers written about, and I think maybe you've spoken about in the past, but I'm not sure. Which is this idea of there may be certain like human or anthropocentric causes or charities you give to that help humans that may in some way result in an increased level of consumption of animals, for example, right? And so then someone might think, well, really, is this a cause that we should prioritize? Because there's this sort of moral conflict here. It seems very complicated. And those sorts of considerations do seem like important considerations. It doesn't seem like we should just ignore them. But on the other hand, it also seems like if we consider every moral conflict that we could potentially get entwined with our giving, it could induce some form of the paralysis we were talking about before. So do you have any thoughts on like how seriously we should take these sorts of potential moral conflicts into account when we're giving aid at all?
I think we should take them into account, and you're correct. I have mentioned this kind of problem before. Let's imagine that you're providing food for starving people, and you're doing it through an agency that includes animal flesh or animal products in the provision to humans. That is a way in which you're helping some and harming others. And I think that is quite deeply problematic. So, and I think effective altruists, if they considering all the relevant interests, would similarly be concerned, and they ought to be similarly concerned, because insofar as you're harming, it's making your aid less effective. It may be effectively addressing the hunger of the humans, but overall, it's not effectively dealing with suffering on planet Earth. So I think we should consider those things. And I think there are going to be some causes where that's going to be the sort of side effects are going to be less damaging, and that's going to be a consideration in favor of opting for those. And again, I would say that very often, not always, but very often, the provision of contraception to people who want it but can't get access to it is going to be a good way of giving. I'm not saying I can't imagine a circumstance in which the provision of contraceptions wouldn't exacerbate some other evil in the world. I mean, perhaps these condoms are being distributed through armed militias that have got access to these condoms, and they're doing a lot of damage, and you're increasing their power by doing that. I can't rule out cases of that kind, but certainly I can imagine situations where those worries would simply not be there.
Mm. Yeah. I know it might be quite hard to give a super specific answer on this, because it will come down potentially to a case-by-case basis, or almost definitely will be. But do you have any sense of the extent to which we should be considering downstream effects? Because, say if, there might be very obvious ones, like, the example you gave, if you're giving sort of food to someone to help them, but that food is made of animals, then, this is sort of like an indirect way, or it's an unintended negative consequence, but it's quite a sort of obvious one. But there are going to be less obvious ways, or more downstream ways that there may be, unintended consequences. So I think one example that I've heard, which I haven't particularly looked into to understand the veracity of it, is donating toward giving bed nets to people to prevent, the infection of malaria. But then those people go on to use those nets as like fishing nets, for example. That doesn't seem to be as direct as to paying directly to feed people with animals. But it still is a sort of downstream negative consequence. Do you have any sort of sense of like how far down the potential chain of downstream consequences we should go?
Yes, so I mean, I think we can generalize your point, and that is that when you save human beings from death, you're saving members of a species that in many ways are highly destructive.
Right.
So they, even if they don't use the very nets you've provided, they may be hunting animals or killing animals or eating animals and contributing to the demand for animal flesh. And I think those are real worries. Again, that would be obviated by provision of contraception. Sorry to keep harping on this, but this is an antinatalist conference,
Yeah,
and it is worth emphasizing the advantage of those kinds of givings.
Yeah, no, of course.
But I'm also I am concerned about thinking too far down the line, because then that begins to blur the distinction between what you're responsible for and what other people are responsible for. So, and let's imagine that you're a doctor and you say, well, if I save people's lives, then they're going to go on and do lots of nasty things on average. And so perhaps I shouldn't be saving people's lives. That's a terrible world to live in, when doctors are not saving people's lives because they're doing this kind of calculus of the longer term effects. Their job is to save lives, and other people's job is to act in appropriate ways and to do appropriate things. And we don't want medical practitioners sort of arbitrating about which lives are worth saving and which lives aren't worth saving. That's a very dangerous ground to get into. And so I think if we're speaking about sufficiently remote negative consequences or possible negative consequences, that shouldn't be certainly an absolute bar to our contributing in those ways. But at the same time, it may be a factor. And so it may be that some of what you give is to causes that are stripped of that concern entirely.
Yeah, so I wanted to get on to some questions that are more based around antinatalism now, but still related to doing good and giving aid. So one thing I have heard from some antinatalists when broaching this idea of giving aid or positive duties in general is you can hear from some antinatalists this sort of message of, well, I've decided not to procreate, and so I'm therefore not sort of continuing to the cycle of suffering in this way, and therefore I'm kind of doing my part. And as such, I've noticed that there are some antinatalists that are therefore resistant to becoming vegan, for example, or giving aid in some way. Do you think there's any legitimacy to this sort of argument in terms of there is a point where you can say I've done my part and maybe not reproducing is part of that? And yeah, maybe as a broader question, can we ever get a sense of a sort of line or threshold where you've done enough?
I think there is a point where one's done enough, but we need to think much more carefully about this. So the fact that, let's say, you're not torturing people doesn't mean to say you're now exempt from not murdering them.
Mm.
So there are going to be a lot of very powerful negative duties that you have, and just because you're doing some of them, you're fulfilling some of them, doesn't mean to say you ought not to fulfill others. Now, I think that the question gets more forced when we begin to think about positive duties, and then again, as I indicated earlier, I think that the case for our having some positive duties is very, very strong. But the more extensive you make those positive duties, the less strong I think the case becomes, because I think it precisely does become plausible to say that you've done enough. Now, can we draw a line somewhere and say this is the point where you've done enough? No, I don't think we can. I don't think we're dealing with the kind of material here, the kind of subject that allows us to draw precise lines. But there will be cases where you clearly are not doing as much as you should be doing. And there'll be other cases where the levels of self-sacrifice are just so great that it's deeply implausible to suggest that this is something that you are required to do. It may be noble, it may be supererogatory, but not required.
Mm. And you've written before, I should have reminded myself just before we did this session of the exact name of the paper, because I'm probably going to butcher it. But it was the response to Peter Singer's famous paper, Famine, Affluence and Morality. I think yours is Famine, Affluence and Procreation, Antinatalism Light, or something like this.
Yes, Famine, Affluence and Procreation, Peter Singer and Antinatalism Light.
Yes. Okay. All right. Well, you're. I know you wrote it, but your memory is way better than mine.
No, it's not my memory. I pulled it up.
Oh, okay. Good. Okay. Yeah. So in that paper, and of course, if I misconstrue anything you've said in that paper, then obviously just correct me. But in that paper, you sort of draw a line between the argument that Peter Singer has already made and implications that it could have for procreation. So if we have like very extensive duties to give aid, for example, to those who are in extreme poverty, that presumably would commit us to then not procreating, because we're sort of diverting resources away from those who are very needy to someone who didn't even need to exist in the first place. And I know your conception or thoughts on the extent of our positive duties and our duties to give aid are different from Peter Singer's. And so I wondered, if we remove sort of philanthropic antinatalist concerns, do you have any sense of how your conception of the extent of our positive duties and our duties to give aid could translate into similar implications for procreation? Would they be more limited implications for procreation on your view, again, if we ignore philanthropic concerns?
Definitely, yes. I think the purpose of that paper was to push people who have views of our duties that are very extensive, and to say, well, if you hold that kind of Singerian view, then you ought to be adopting much more antinatalism than you otherwise would. For example, you ought to be not having children of your own, because that would free up a large amount of money for you to provide to the world's poor. Now, if the response is that not producing children of your own and rearing them is a serious sacrifice, well, now we have some sense of what constitutes a serious sacrifice, and that's going to reduce the extent of the duty for those people who accept Peter Singer's conclusion. So yes, it's intended as a kind of dilemma for people with very extensive views on our duties to give. Either they need to embrace much more antinatalism than they do, or they need to back off the extent of the duties.
So we spoke before about potential moral conflicts, and that those might not just arise in the question of giving aid, but there might be moral conflicts in all sorts of actions we're considering taking. And I wondered, So one one example, and I think you've spoken about this in a previous interview. One example that's often put to antinatalists, generally specifically by vegans, is this idea that, and it's actually been mentioned previously in the conference yesterday, is this conflict between human procreation and the sort of suffering in the wild. And I know that both you and I are sentiocentric in our moral concerns, right? We think that sentient beings should be considered morally. But I wondered if you had any thoughts on, when it comes to specific decisions like procreation, for example, how much scope should we have for considering other sentient beings in the sort of considerations we have around something like procreation? Because I know, obviously, in your misanthropic argument for antinatalism, you say that we should take into account the suffering of animals in farms, for example, as a reason that would count against creating humans. But then these sorts of people would say that, well, similarly, we should consider the animals outside of farms and in the wild in our considerations as well. And I wondered, how do you think we should balance those different considerations of other sentient beings when we're making a decision like procreating?
Thank you for asking that question. So I'm not moved by the argument that we should have more children, because that will reduce the number of wild animals and therefore reduce the amount of wild animal suffering. And that is connected in part with what I said earlier about separating out what decisions need to be made. So you're deciding whether to have children, and those children are going to suffer and they're going to die. And I think you've got a responsibility not to do that to them. Now, if you were to create people, and there might be this contribution to a larger alleged positive effect for wild animals, that looks too remote and too beyond your scope of responsibility to me for you to be motivated by that. What you're doing is, anybody who says, I'm going to have children because it's going to reduce wild animal suffering, is discounting the obvious harms that their children will suffer in exchange for a contribution, probably an imperceptible contribution, to an overall reduction in the number of wild animals that there are. And that is just highly speculative. And I think that when you are comparing the prevention of an obvious harm with the prevention of some speculative harm, you ought to give priority to the obvious. I also think that my sort of moderate views on the scope of responsibility are relevant here. And that is that we shouldn't have God complexes. We are not responsible for the suffering that takes place in the wild. This is a deeply tragic, horrific feature of the world. But you're not responsible for that unless you're contributing to it in some way. And but you are responsible for whether you have children or not. That's an action that is immediately within your control. And that is something that you're going to be responsible for. So I'm a little worried that people with these very extensive duties, they have a kind of benign God complex. It's not that they think they're entitled in the way in which a God would be entitled, but they think that they have responsibilities that reach the outer limits of their capacity. And I think that is just to overstate the extent of your responsibility.
Yeah, it's frustrating because there are so many more questions that I want to go off on kind of tangents on, but I know that we're limited on time, so I'm going to keep it to the questions that we've prepared, and also we've got some audience questions as well. So I'll sort of integrate those into the questions we have going forward. So my next question was, so Antinatalist Advocacy, obviously the organization running this conference, on our website, we put together a guide, like a 5-step guide, which we think serves as, like a sort of good foundation for someone to sort of adopt and then go forward if they're looking to want to do good or reduce suffering in the world. And I wanted to read out those steps to you and see if you have any thoughts on if there are any potential additional steps that we maybe have missed out that you think maybe are helpful for people to consider if they're looking to do good in the world, and also if you maybe have any issues with the steps that we've put forward in the guide. So the first step is not to have any more children. And the reason we say that is obviously because someone might have already had children by the time they've seen the guide. The second one is to become vegan. The third one is to plan your career. So think about how you can use the time that you will spend over your career to do some good in the world. The fourth is to start donating. And then the fifth is to build the antinatalist community. And what we mean by that is more to improve the quality and the capacity that people have within the community to do good, rather than necessarily grow it in size, although obviously that would be nice as well. Do you have any thoughts on those steps, and any additional steps that you think might be good for people to consider?
Are they meant to be in order of priority?
Not necessarily. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. It's
Okay.
not necessarily in that order.
Okay, good. Well, I mean, I think there are quite a few things that could be said, but let me just say some of them. In terms of career planning, so again, what worries me is that sometimes advice is given to people to say, look, instead of going into working, let's say, directly for a charitable organization, what you should do is go to Wall Street, earn massive amounts of money that you can then contribute. And I'm not saying there are not people for whom that would be good advice, but let's imagine that that kind of career choice for a particular person would be soul destroying. So it would be the most effective way that they could help other people, but it would be soul destroying for them. They'd be pretty miserable throughout their lives. I think that's a steep sacrifice to require of somebody, or even to ask of somebody. But it may be that your choice of careers is not as stark as that. It's not as stark between something that you're passionate about and something that you would loathe, but something that you like and something you'd like a little less. And then maybe in that kind of case, the effectiveness would be a tiebreaker, or would weigh things in the opposite direction. But what I would not want people to do, I wouldn't want to call for people to set aside their own interests and proclivities and talents in deciding what kind of career to go into. That wouldn't be, and maybe a lot of the effective altruists would agree with me too. They might just say, well, this is not sustainable. If you don't have your heart in your job, maybe this is not something you're going to be able to do for an extended period of time. I mean, insofar as they agree with me, that's fine. But nonetheless, I think that bit of advice would hold. I do think that not having children and becoming vegan are very important steps, because having children and eating animals and their products are very harmful activities. And to stop doing those, you immediately stop harming. And I would prioritize the stopping of harming over the provision of benefit. But that doesn't mean to say that I don't think there are some duties to provide benefit. There are, but if you're giving a vast amount of charity, that's not going to be any kind of cover for torturing people in your spare time for your amusement. You need to first, or not necessarily first and then move on, but you need to have some kind of priority to not harming.
So I was going to ask an audience question now. We've got a few. So the first one I was going to ask was, do you have any recommendations on books, or I'll expand that out to any other material that we might want to look at, that you would recommend for people that are interested in thinking about these sorts of things, of like doing good, or the extent of our duties to do good, and where we maybe might want to think about doing good, like the cause areas and stuff like that? Obviously, recommendation of very practical ethics, but beyond your book, do you have any other materials or books that you would recommend people have a look at?
Well, I think you can interpret your question in two ways. The one is looking into what the extent of our duty is. And then I would recommend that people read a wide range of views. So I think they should read Peter Singer and read Thomas Pogge. And I know that you're going to be interviewing Rivka Weinberg later. She's got a view on the other end of the spectrum, or much closer to the other end of the spectrum. And so read a range of views so that you can see which of these positions, if any, you think is tenable, whether you think there's some better one that ought to be developed. But the other question is, if one is going to give now, then how should one give? And I suppose, again, I would recommend reading a diversity of views, just because it's a way of testing particular hypotheses and particular claims.
Mm. So I had a few of the questions that we had planned. We had a few on your book, Better Never to Have Been, because I'm sure you've been keeping track, but for anyone watching that might not have realized, next year will be its 20th anniversary. So we had some questions related to Better Never to Have Been and the fact that it's coming up to 20 years. The first is quite a broad question. So I have specific questions to follow up if you need them for this broad one, but I'll start with the broad one. Do you have any just like key reflections on the book and the reactions to the book over the past 2 decades that you'd like to highlight, or have been a sort of a significant reflection for you?
I don't quite know how to answer that. I've been very pleased, of course, by how widely read it's been. It was written as an academic book, and it's been read by large numbers of non-academics, and that's very gratifying, without it being dumbed down in any way or pandering in any kind of way. So I'm very gratified by that, and I'm pleased to have seen in the intervening years the development of an antinatalist movement. My strengths do not lie at all in that kind of activism. I think other people are really good at that, and I admire them for doing the work that they do, and I commend them on it and encourage them to do more of it. But maybe some of your more specific questions will hone in on what it is you're wanting me to respond to.
Yeah, no, of course. So one of the more specific questions I had was, obviously there are, at least 2 sort of domains that reaction could have come from. So you were saying that you wrote it, with a sort of more academic inclination. And so obviously you're going to get a reaction from the sort of academic area of society, but then there's also a reaction from more sort of, should we just say popular area of society. If you, I'm guessing on the popular end, you've kind of already answered that in that you were quite pleased that there was a relatively positive reaction from a lot of people. On the academic end, I know there's been a lot of people that have responded to it, and obviously a lot of disagreement. But has the response you've got on the academic side of things been better or worse than you were expecting? I'm assuming you probably thought it was going to be more negative and more pushback, but has it been better or worse than you were expecting?
Well, first of all, there's just how much feedback. So when one writes a book like that, one doesn't really expect that there will be a large amount of response, because most academic books just don't get that kind of response. And so I have been pleased by how many people have engaged the ideas. Of course, most of them are critical, and I think that's to be expected within the academic world, because when somebody writes a new book or a new paper, they don't want to say, yeah, what he said. They want to say why he's wrong, and they're going to want to come up with an argument for that. There was a time early on when I read everything that was written in response, and I tried to respond to all of it. But over the years, the amount of material, academic material, that's responded to that book and to other related work, it's just become so vast that I can't even keep up with reading it. And I also worry that if I read it and I want to reply, that I'm going to just get sucked into working only on this and not on anything else. So I hope in due course I'll live long enough that I'll be able to get around to more of that material and read it and respond to it. But it's not a priority now.
And I think you might have shared reflections on this next question before, but you were saying that you'd had some positive responses from sort of ordinary people that have got in contact with you. But since Better Never to Have Been has come out, and obviously Better Never to Have Been would have contributed partly to this, there has been this growing interest in antinatalism. Now, that is obviously going to be as a result of all manner of different factors. But are you surprised by the increasing popularity of antinatalism, or did you kind of always expect that it would gain interest over time, as you know, now we have the internet and the exchange of ideas is more free flowing? Yeah, are you surprised by the increasing popularity of it?
Yes, I had no expectation of it.
Right. Oh, okay. Yeah, and what in terms of the responses you've had on the academic side, or any, because this may have come from a layperson, have there been any responses that have given you more food for thought? Like, are there any particular notable ones that, you know, I can understand none of them have swayed you to become a pro-natalist or anything, but were there any that that have given you more thought for consideration?
I think there have been some intellectually serious objections that I've had to respond to. And in those responses, I've acknowledged them as ones that are worthy of consideration and response. That's certainly true. It's hard for me here not to recall all the details of that, and we wouldn't have the time to get into that kind of detail. But there have been cases, but none of them have persuaded me. I think there's a kind of fundamental truth here that when you create a being, that being is going to suffer and it's going to die, a sentient being. And if you just sort of step back from the normalness and the naturalness of procreation, and you ask yourself, how can that possibly be justified? I think there's a very heavy burden of proof on non-antinatalists, not just on pronatalists, but people who might be indifferent to procreation. And I just don't think that fundamental insight has been addressed, and certainly it hasn't been shaken in me.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I know we're running out of time, so my final question was just going to be on if there's anything you have forthcoming or anything you're working on at the moment that you would. I know you don't always like to share what you're working on, but just in case there is anything that you'd like to notify people about, is there anything that you're working on or coming up in the future that you'd like to share some news on at all?
There are a few things. I'm trying to finish off work at the moment on a book on some relatively neglected issues in animal ethics. And one chapter is on wild animal suffering, which you mentioned earlier.
Right.
There's also a chapter on the badness of death for animals and a range of other things. So hopefully in due course, but there's a long runway with these academic books and the publication of them. So I don't think it'll be imminent.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, and I'm looking forward to that. I know you've sort of briefly or vaguely mentioned that work before, but that's it's good to hear that it's it's in the pipeline, however long that pipe may be. Yeah, I just wanted to thank you again, Professor Benatar, for giving up your time, and also obviously the work you've done on this in very practical ethics and antinatalism more broadly, and for answering all my questions. Thank you so much.
My thanks to you for organizing the conference and for all the good work that you and your colleagues do.
No, thank you. I appreciate it.